Hello, folks. I'm Katie.
I'm Vinny, and this is Learn Real Good.
Back.
Again.
Can't stop us.
Can't get rid of us. You tried. We know you tried.
This is the problem with easy access to the internet. Anyone, including us, can start a podcast, and no one can stop us.
I know. We go. We sit down, we talk, we record, and they put it online, and now you have to listen to us. You have to.
You have to. $50 for microphones, and now suddenly you have to listen to us every week after week, for half of the year.
But
you like it.
You love it.
Because you get to learn
Real
good.
Learn real good.
So this is a show about learning, right?
Yeah. Good.
And goodness. Good things.
Good things that you can learn.
What are some good things that you're thinking of today? What are some things that you're liking in life,
like
Vinny?
just in general?
Just in life,
just
yeah. What's making you happy? What are some Vinny's list of good things?
It's when it's a beautiful day out, and it's not too hot, and it's not too cold, and it's bright, and you can go for a walk, and the trees are out, and the animals are singing.
Out to play.
Yeah, everything is great.
Animals singing.
Yeah, it's just a nice day.
You know, I'm with you, except for I would be alarmed by animals, like non-bird animals singing.
Well, that's usually what I mean. I like, you hear dogs barking, and then
okay, I see.
You hear the squirrels chittering here and there, and the birds are singing, and every so often you hear the cicadas buzzing.
Oh yes, which you like to pretend is the sound of electrical wires.
Yeah.
Yes, and we have a fake argument about the nature of that buzzing sound.
Correct.
And how I say it is cicadas. And you say it's electricity. Yeah.
Because that's what I imagine electricity wires would sound like if you could hear them.
If we could hear
them. If you could hear electrical wires, it would just sound like the cicadas.
Irregular buzzing?
Yeah. Just every so often, the electricity hits a resonant frequency, and you just hear that bzzz.
Well, that's not a real fact.
No. That's
but we will be sharing real facts. Real science facts.
Yeah.
And after we do that, we have a guest.
A guest.
We have a great guest.
I'm excited to talk to
I'm very excited. So shall we move on to the fact
science facts.
It does oscillate the nature of this theme song each week. But
I just like changing it up.
Yeah.
It's spur of the moment.
It's great.
I would love to hear a science fact, Katie.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So this is a sweet science fact for you.
All right.
Get it? Sweet.
Not yet, because you haven't said the fact.
No, do you get the joke without me giving you any of the context?
No.
So what do you think it's going to be about if I'm saying sweet?
It's sweet. It's like about like a nice penthouse suite.
I knew you were looking for another connotation.
Yeah.
No, we're talking sugar today.
Oh.
In particular, we're
What'd
talking...
you call me?
Sugar. We're talking artificial sweeteners.
Okay. Stevia.
Stevia is in this, but although it comes out looking good.
Okay.
So, as you know, for a long time, it has been common to have sugar-free, artificially sweetened beverages and food to avoid the nasty calories.
Horrible sugar.
Because of this sort of classic understanding and gross simplification of calories in... calories out, right?
If you want minimize calories in, get rid of your sugar. That's what I've learned.
If you want to maintain a consistent weight, right, you have to have the calories going in equal the calories going out, and that the nature of those calories doesn't matter. We haven't gotten to that. I like to build up for many minutes until there's a payoff. So there arose these artificial sweeteners, which are like hundreds of times sweeter than sugar. Right. It's not that they don't have calories. It's just that they're so sweet, you only need a teeny tiny amount of it.
To get the same sweetness.
The same sweetness.
Okay.
And the irony is, in a packet of artificial sweetener, there tends to be... It's filled with bulking agents because otherwise in this packet, it would be like, a dot, right? And so sometimes they'll even use glucose itself as a...
Whoa. Sugar?
Yeah, they'll use sugar as a bulking agent and put like a teeny drop. And that's why there's any calories at all. Okay. So this study came out. They tested 4 different sweeteners, including saccharin, sucralose, your sweet stevia, and aspartame. And what they did was they gave it to people. So people would get a packet and they wouldn't know what they were ingesting.
Mystery packet.
And they were required to use a certain number of them per day in the absence of any other artificial sweeteners. Okay. They could have normal sugar, just no fake sugar.
Sure.
And then they tested their blood glucose levels.
Interesting.
And what's interesting is their blood glucose levels were heightened following consumption. Interesting because they even had a control where people had just sugar and the blood glucose levels of people with artificial sweetener was higher.
What is happening, Katie?
Right. So the assumption is that if we eat these artificial sweeteners, they won't stimulate insulin the way real sugar does. But that is not true. And that's sort of been suspected for some time. Okay, so then the question is why, right? Why?
That was the question I had. Why?
So it seems like it actually has doesn't have anything to do with how we break down glucose.
Okay.
But actually it has to do with our microbiome. Oh. So what they did was they took the stool samples from people in this experiment and gave it to mice.
Yeah, normal.
I don't know why there was a cross thing to do.
Yeah.
And they found that heightened blood glucose levels were held constant. Whoa. So it had nothing to do with the thing they were consuming, but how it was affecting later in the gut, in the intestines. And so it has something to do with alteration to the microbiome community. We don't really know what exactly, but that could explain a lot of the observations that have been made in terms of people who drink like 30 liters of Diet Coke.
You still have this reaction.
Yeah, exactly. So if it still ends up leading to a heightened blood glucose, you're still going to overeat.
You didn't do anything.
And that's a problem.
In fact, it made it worse because your glucose level is
higher than sugar.
What a mistake.
Interesting.
We goofed.
But I mean, this sort of unveils this overall issue where, again, people assume that it's just the numbers of the energy in the food you're eating. They're not thinking of these other effects, right? There might be 0 calories, but that doesn't mean that you're going to lose weight or it's, healthier.
Fascinating. So all these fake sugars.
I mean,
it's a trap. It's
a trap. But people have suspected this, and now we're finally putting some data to it.
So who's going to be arrested?
Well, I want to point out only 2 of those 4 sweeteners saw this. So aspartame and stevia didn't show this effect. It was just the sucralose and saccharin.
But aspartame has a bad reputation generally.
Well, so there are certain conditions that will make it impossible, I believe, to break down aspartame. Well, actually, it's either you can't break down aspartame or you break it down to something toxic, and those people should avoid it. There's a warning on like things that contain aspartame that if you have phenylketonuria or something like that, you shouldn't consume aspartame.
So stevia.
That's a different problem. Stevia.
Stevia's safe.
Stevia's safe. All yes, right. This is brought to you by Big Stevia.
Yeah, Big Stevia paid for this.
Thank you, Big Stevia. I'm going to drink this jug of stevia right now. Sweet stevia.
Cool. That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, the whole gut biome thing is like a whole brand new frontier, and we're learning so much about it.
Absolutely. It's gonna, it's doing a lot.
It's a whole ecological world within us.
Well, it's the thing. We're not one organism.
We're
a planet, basically.
Bono lied to us.
Bono?
Yeah, he said one. Yeah.
One? Okay. Wow. Okay.
Well, we're not the same. I guess he was right in the end.
What's your science fact, Vinny?
All right, my science fact has to do with water.
Ooh, I'm drinking water right now.
Are you familiar with different phases of water?
Oh, like frozen?
Yes.
Gaseous?
Yes.
Liquid?
Yes.
Is there a 4th?
Well, plasma is often cited as the 4th. It's like superheated and it's ionized, so that's like beyond gas.
Beyond gas?
Beyond gas. But
that's news to me.
Yeah, so plasma.
Is that the fact?
That's not my fact, but just as you think of solid,
sure,
liquid, gas.
Yes.
If you're familiar with plasma.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about water and most solids and liquids, the materials,
sure,
they have multiple phases, not just 3 things. And so there are actually 20 phases of water.
Stop it.
There are 20 phases of water. Now, what does that mean? 20 phases of water.
Is this somehow connected to like different types of snow, like different levels of freezing and crystal structure?
Yes, kind of. Yes. So snow has different solids, but snow is not quite the same. Ice is like one contiguous,
right?
Whereas snow is discrete snowflakes. So
cut that.
No, it's still good. So water hits a bunch of different phases depending on 2 things: the temperature, the ambient temperature, and the pressure. So it's a known fact: if you take a pot of water, you go up a mountain and you try to boil it, it doesn't boil at 100. It boils at a lower temperature because the pressure is different, because the air pressure is different.
Everyone knows
Everybody knows that. If you've been up a mountain, you tried to make a pot of tea, you're like, whoa, this tea boiled super fast. And that's because it boiled at a lower temperature.
That's why I'm going to build my tea house at the top of a mountain, save on my energy bill.
So you can actually create a map of like plotting all these temperatures and all of the pressures and then see like what happens to water in all of these different combinations of temperature and pressure.
Beautiful.
And so we live at like room temperature generally, and we live at one atmosphere, like the general atmosphere that we live in.
Sure.
And so we're familiar with the three phases of solid,
everyone knows,
liquid, gas. And that's what we're used to. But at very low temperatures, you can have different sorts of liquids. And when they talk about phases and different sorts of liquids, all it means is that the atoms in the mix partner up different.
Oh.
They like hang out differently.
The hydrogen bonding is
different?
The
hydrogens, the oxygen, all of these bonds are different. So if you think about like how you pack boxes in a truck, like you're moving and you stack a bunch of boxes. Mm-hmm. You put them on one top of each other like Lego bricks, and they make like a nice wall and they stable. Or you think about oranges. Right, you don't stack them like you would boxes. Right. You make little pyramids, and they go in. So different shapes require different packing, and that's what's happening with the molecules in water. And there's 20 different ways that these molecules can be arranged at different temperatures and pressures.
Can humans actually observe these different phases?
So some of them are very difficult to do, and some of them are purely theoretical.
Oh boy!
Because we just can't get it down to like 2 Kelvin and 1 million atmospheres or whatever it is. And so some of them are like, okay, well, we think this is what's going to happen. And then there's some that we've seen and we're like, whoa, the water behaves in this really weird way. And so some of the new research, my little science fact, the new thing, is that a team of scientists have made a computer model that models water at like very low temperatures, and they're able to replicate like the very weird behavior that they see. And so normally at very low temperatures, water wants to become a solid, wants to become ice.
Yeah.
It's like, I need to be ice. I got to arrange myself.
Relatable.
But if you change the pressure, you can keep it as liquid.
Whoa.
And so you can keep this very, very cold, super cool liquid water. And like the water forms these like long chains. It's just like.
Are there videos of this? This sounds crazy.
I haven't seen any videos. No. Maybe there. I would love to see that. But so now these scientists have made a computer model that goes even beyond that.
Whoa.
And so now it's like clumpy water. So the
water,
the liquid is like arranged in like colloidal, like kind of clumpy water. It's like liquid, semi-solid. It has this crazy like configuration of bonds between the electrons in these particles.
They call it Jello.
So it's Jello water, yeah. And so basically what happens is if you get the exact right temperature and the exact right pressure, you can get both of these liquids at the same time. And so this water exists in liquid, in like the chain liquid, and in the colloidal state, which is like a double liquid state. So there's this 2 liquid state of water that's been discovered.
Whoa. And what are the implications for this?
Just that like we understand how water works in very, very specific cases. And you can computer model it. So if your computer model can replicate what you're seeing in the lab, that means you have a very good computer model. And they had a very hard time getting this computer model to replicate the behavior they were seeing. And they finally succeeded. This one team did it.
When can I get colloidal water at like a soft drink station?
Yeah, I don't think we'll be able to get that anytime soon. But yeah, so they basically can simulate in a computer these really weird states of water. I thought that was really cool.
I want to drink it now. I want Jello water.
Jello water sounds pretty cool. But it's just pure water. There's no Jello in it.
Yeah, no, I know.
It's vegetarian friendly.
This is sponsored by the Vegans Association.
The vegans,
Yes.
Because Jello has bones in it.
Yes. I mean, you can make it out of seaweed, but forget it. Just water. Pure water Jello.
Pure water Jello.
Yes.
You do have to have it at like 10 Kelvin or something.
So?
It's like
I'm willing to go
on a hot
there.
day, that's going to be refreshing.
I'm a Canadian. I can handle it.
There you go.
Well, that's pretty cool.
That's my little
Very cool fact.
Yeah, 20 phases of water. That's pretty wild.
It's excessive. I think 5 would have been good.
Yeah.
I don't think we need full 20.
Just make it 5. Just cut out the other 15.
Well, that was fun.
Yeah.
But it's time to get to the heart of the show.
Our
guest, Vinny.
Yes. Today's guest is Christian Cheung. He's a researcher in the Human Performance and Health Research Lab at the University of Guelph, where he's currently completing his PhD. His research focuses on the effects of cannabis on the cardiovascular system and on the body's ability to perform exercise. Outside the lab, Christian likes to spend his time riding his bike and enjoying all things sports and exercise. Hello, Christian.
Welcome to the show, Christian.
Hey, Vinny. Hey, Katie. Thank you for having me today.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah,
Ooh,
welcome.
Boy,
Yeah.
we got some questions for you.
Yeah. Lots of questions.
That's perfect. I'm here to answer them. So,
well, wow, what a match made in heaven.
The nature of the show. So, studying cannabis. So, why don't you tell us what is the effects of cannabis on the cardiovascular system? We know very little about it.
Yeah, what is the cardiovascular system?
Okay, let's
and
start
what does
there.
cannabis do to it?
Yeah, let's start with that. Let's redo. What's the cardiovascular system?
Yeah. So basically, the cardiovascular system. I was gonna make a pun. I'm gonna say at its heart is literally your heart and blood vessels. So
nice.
Arteries and veins and everything in between them. Yeah, I think most people are probably familiar with what that is, but also cannabis too, because that's becoming increasingly popular today as well.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so cannabis. What's happening here? What does it do to the cardiovascular system in general?
I'm really glad you asked that. And one thing that you guys said earlier was said we don't know what cannabis does to the cardiovascular system, and I love that you said that because I would say that applies to everyone. That we as a whole really don't know a whole lot about what cannabis does to the cardiovascular system.
Wow.
And one of the things, and I guess maybe is good to start from the reason I'm studying it is because a lot of people smoke cannabis all across the world, and a lot of people smoke cigarettes as well. And we know for a long time we've known for a long time that cigarettes are really bad for your cardiovascular system.
Mm-hmm.
So now part of my goal in my research is to try to figure out, do we see something similar with cannabis? Do we see something different? I don't know yet, but we're working on that right now.
Okay, so on that subject, what are the basic effects of cigarettes then before we move on to maybe how cannabis is different? Is it all just like what percentage of the effects of cigarettes on the cardiovascular system are from just smoking a thing versus the stuff that's in a cigarette specifically?
That's a really good question too. I wish I had an exact number for you to tell you what it is, but I don't know. I can tell you though that it is, as you point out, a mix of both. So we know that, being in an environment where you're exposed to smoke constantly is bad for you, even if you're not smoking it. We know secondhand smoke is bad for you. So it's probably a bit of both, what's in the cigarette and the fact that it's being smoked. But when it comes to knowing what cigarettes do to the cardiovascular system, it's really simple. They increase your risk of cardiovascular disease and they reduce the function of pretty much every kind of cardiovascular tissue we have. So
what's actually happening? Like, is it making the blood not flow? Is it making the heart muscles weak? Like, what's the mechanism happening there?
Yeah. So for cigarettes, what you see generally is you'll see an increase in cholesterol that happens, which has kind of a cascade of effects. We see stiffening of our arteries, plaques in the walls, and, these kinds of things and these typical disease cascades are how you end up with the cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes and things like that are associated with cigarettes.
And so when you're looking at cannabis, are you looking at smoking or in vaping or
eating?
Like edibles?
Yeah, another fun question to kind of answer. It's a good one too, because I think as many people know, you can get cannabis in edible form, smoke it traditionally, and as you point out, vaping, and there's all kinds of different ways you can do it. In our lab, generally we focused on looking at inhalation methods because it's a little bit more predictable than ingestion. So, I think I don't know about you guys, but you might hear the stories of people, having a little bit of too much of an edible and, it takes a long time to come down. So those are the exact kind of problems we don't want in the lab, is that the dosing is just a bit easier with inhalation. So we're looking at both smoking and vaporizing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how are you performing these studies? Like, what's happening? Is it just a bunch of people recruiting people who want to smoke cannabis?
Yeah. So it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. We have people coming into the lab and smoking or vaporizing, inhaling cannabis in our actual lab space, which is pretty funny. We have like a custom built little chamber that we have that basically filters the air so that we don't set off all the fire alarms in our building. Right. And then we do our cardiovascular measures before and after. And to answer your question about recruiting, very easy. Yeah. Very easy to find people who would do it.
And so what are your exercises? What are your cardiovascular tests before and after? Is it just like check your blood pressure, or is it like do this bike ride?
Run 5K.
Yeah, so we do take blood pressure before and after. We look at kind of the things that most people be familiar with, so blood pressure and heart rate. But what's really cool about our lab is that we rely quite a bit on ultrasound imaging. So we can actually take ultrasound images of the heart and the arteries and do different protocols to test essentially how well they're functioning. We can also do non-invasive measures of understanding how stiff our arteries get, acutely right after people smoke. And then, so in addition to those cardiovascular measures, which we look at pre and post, we also, as the lab name says, we are a human performance lab. So we have lots of exercise equipment in the lab, and we have people typically do cycling exercise because it's really easy to quantify, how much work people are doing. Whereas running, for example, is a little bit trickier.
Fascinating.
Whoa. And do you know, or do you have any expectations of like the differential effects of the two chemicals or main chemicals? So I know very little about cannabis, but I know that there's THC and there's CBD, and THC is like the I'm seeing things. The
mind altering part.
And the CBD is like the make you feel chill one. That's right. Something like that.
So maybe some context for the listeners. The reason that those two often come up is because those are the ones that are most commonly found in cannabis. So they're typically the two most abundant compounds in the actual cannabis flower, which you might burn and inhale. And yeah, you're exactly right. THC is the one that, it gets you high. It's the one that is responsible for all of the effects that people think when they think cannabis. And CBD is the one that actually, it theoretically should not have very many of those psychoactive effects, but it's been investigated for a lot of different health benefits. So a lot of the things you hear about the potential, medicinal uses of cannabis, whether it be antioxidant or anti-inflammatory, helping with pain relief, CBD is thought to be behind a lot of those effects. So to answer your question of how we study them and how we look at them is we can just use different cannabis strains that have different amounts of each compound in each one. So we're doing that as well.
So hang on, do you have like a library of cannabis at your disposal?
We have a safe that's in a restricted access room that has all our cannabis samples in it.
Okay, and how many different samples do you have to have? Is it just like 10?
So it's I don't think I can share the exact number. I'm not
That's fine,
sure,
that's
but
fine
it's we basically, when we put in like a request for how much we want, we get the exact amount for the amount of participants we have.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so cannabis was legalized in Canada when? Not that long ago, 5-ish years ago?
2018. I can tell you the exact date. It was October 17th, 2018. And the reason I remember that well is part of how, well, really most of how I ended up doing what I'm doing is that was the semester I started my master's degree.
Because I was going to say, that must have made doing research on this so much easier. I can't imagine
it being legal before that.
There must people. Well, you tell us, Christian. Were people doing research at all like this, but prior to it being legalized?
Sure. Yeah. Well, they were, believe it or not, at least in Canada, I know, and the U.S. too. What actually happened was it became a little bit trickier for a bit, and a lot of that I won't go into the details too because I don't think this is maybe the most exciting stuff, but. Essentially, the way it was before when it was illegal was people could apply for research exemptions. The challenge of doing cannabis research today, now that it's legal in Canada, where I work at least, is that the government has tried to put in all these new systems to get research approved. And there's I will speak kindly and say there was some growing pains in doing that. So I think it's been challenging to do for the past few years. However, going forward, I think everyone's hoping that it becomes a little bit easier to do.
Right. Wow.
And is the motivation for looking at the effects of cannabis on the cardiovascular system, is it coming from the perspective of, well, we know cigarettes are bad, is cannabis bad too? Or is it more of sort of a positive outlook of cannabis helping the cardiovascular system?
Yeah, I've been injured and maybe can cannabis help my performance?
So I think the best way to think about it is that the reason we look at cannabis in our integrated cardiovascular and exercise lab is for two reasons. One is because we know a lot of people use cannabis, and that includes athletes. So that's kind of one side of what we're interested in. It's sort of regulated by anti-doping agencies, sort of not, really inconsistent rulings. So we're hoping to get some research to kind of inform those decisions to, maybe help the athletes out a little so that they, maybe the rules that they have to navigate within their sport are, a little bit more clear, so that it's a little bit easier, kind of like for the rest of us in Canada, at least, where, any adult can go to a cannabis store. And the cardiovascular side of it is really linked back to the smoking. So when, if we approach this research thinking with the idea that, a lot of people smoke cigarettes and we know that's bad for you. A lot of people smoke cannabis. And as you pointed out before with the cigarettes, it's both what's in it and the smoking. We don't know if with cannabis, it's the smoking and what's in it. It's obviously the smoking is probably bad for you, but we're kind of trying to fill those gaps right there.
Yeah, I guess so.
You mentioned athletes. Are there any sports where cannabis is totally fine? Like, is there any sports where they're like giver, or is it regulated to some degree for all of them that you know of?
So it's tricky. So I'll kind of start from the top, I guess, is the easier way to think about it. So the World Anti-Doping Agency, which regulates, the kind of the big international competitions you'd think of, like the Olympics, things like that. Basically, what they say is that cannabinoids are banned during the competition phase of the season, with some with zero tolerance and some with thresholds. The notable exception is that they actually don't ban CBD. So you can use CBD.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then it would take too long to maybe go through every example, but a lot of private professional sports leagues no longer test for it. So I know a number of major sporting leagues that have said, it's still on our ban list, but we don't test for it. So I don't really know the purpose of doing that, but nonetheless, it's still there.
One question with that. So I have had CBD oil because I struggle with anxiety and I wanted to explore it. It didn't do anything for me. But one thing I noticed is when you're ordering the CBD oil, they always say like may contain traces of THC. So I suppose it's really hard to completely purify it out. Do you think there'd be any concern for an athlete who is like taking a lot of CBD oil that they could have traces of THC enough that it would trigger some sort of alarms?
It sounds like you guys have been doing some readings because these feel like very leading questions because that's a great one. But I would say that people who are taking CBD products should not just worry about trace amounts. They should worry about substantial amounts. So there's actually been a number of studies that have shown really albeit some of these were in less regulated times. So keep that in mind. And they were done in the States where it's a little bit different than Canada. But they actually showed that there was really inaccurate labeling, both of CBD and THC.
Oh, wow.
And when it comes to athletes, which is kind of the world we care a little bit more about in our lab, a really nice research group that works in anti-doping did a study that showed a really, I forget how many products they tested, but I think it was in the tens. And they showed a non-insignificant portion of them would actually trigger anti-doping violations.
Oh,
so
no.
I don't even think it's like trace amounts we should worry about. It's like a lot you should worry about.
So even if the label says trace amounts, you're not sure you can trust it.
Yeah, and I think it varies where you are. I think in Canada, where the government has essentially said we're taking control of this and they're being really strict, I think I would feel a lot safer. The legislation is more complex in the States and pretty much everywhere else in the world, it's still illegal. So I would say anywhere else, I would be very concerned about the accuracy of the labeling.
So listen to that, all you Olympians and the Olympians out there.
That's incredible. So what kind of stuff are you finding in the research so far?
Yeah, so we just actually wrapped up data collection on our first big acute cannabis study earlier this year, which was really exciting. And the main thing that we saw, at least with respect to exercise, was that people, maybe unsurprisingly, did worse on the exercise tests we gave them. What was interesting was that we tested different conditions. So we tested when people smoked and when people used a vaporizer. And we also tested cannabis that was really high in THC, and then cannabis that had almost no THC, but high in CBD. And what we saw was that the cannabis with the CBD, so the one that essentially doesn't make you high, did not affect people's ability to do exercise at all. So they were exactly the same.
Okay.
But what was cool was that when we looked at the cannabis with lots of THC in it, what we saw was that performance was reduced, and it didn't matter if you smoked or you vaporized. So it seems like the effect is probably dependent on the compound. If I can share a little anecdote, I think this is maybe my favorite one. And looking back, I wish I had a better way of like quantifying something so that I could actually report this. But a lot of our participants on the THC days, so I'll remind you, the ones where people did worse, were very excited about how well they did. They thought they did much better. They felt vastly improved.
So the perception of performance is not necessarily in line with the actual performance.
Yeah, I will say I don't know if that happened for everyone. I don't have like a way of measuring. I don't know what happened in the whole group, but I have a few notes on my phone of just funny quotes I have from really people talking about how excited about to see their results were because they were so sure that they improved like X amount.
Wow.
Is like an inflated sense of self a common side effect of THC?
If it is, I wasn't prepared for it going into the study.
I did amazing.
Yeah.
That's very funny. And so do you have any, I guess it's probably early, but do you have any ideas why? Is it just like they're so space cadet-y with the THC that they're not paying attention to the exercise? Is there something physiologically happening because of the THC?
So I do have some ideas, but not fully formed.
So
one of the things that we didn't do a very good job in our study, and it's probably because I work in a physiology lab and not a psychophysiology or a psychology lab, but we did very little to quantify, stealing quote from my boss, what he says is we don't quantify what happens between the ears. So we don't have anything to really, I can't really speak on whether or not the effects might have been like a psychological effect, but we do think that there might be some physiological effects, which are cool. So one of the things that we can do in our exercise physiology lab is we can basically quantify how much metabolic work people do when they exercise. And we can also quantify the amount of people or external work people do. And what we can do is when we look across conditions, we can kind of hold those two side by side to say, X amount of internal work or physiological work should translate to how much you can, do on the bike. And one thing that's cool that we saw with the cannabis was that when we kept the external work the same, people had really high heart rates on the THC days. So that could be an effect of the THC, and it probably is. But what it suggests to us is that maybe people are physiologically, or at least from a cardiovascular perspective, a little bit less efficient in their body's coordinated response to matching the exercise. So we think that there's possibly that physiological mechanism that really people are less efficient. And, then when they do the same amount of, or try to do the same amount of work physiologically, it translates to less external work.
Now, I guess my question is what drop in efficiency is there? Is it like a huge drop or like a slight drop? Like what percentage roughly?
So I don't know the exact number for the efficiency calculation, but what I can tell you is that we saw about a 5% reduction in external work. And there was no difference in internal work across the conditions. Wow. So I guess, I don't know, is that 5%? I don't really know math that well.
Right. Sure, that's okay. Yeah, but that's still certainly noticeable.
Well, in elite sports where they're measuring things by thousandths of seconds, right? That's going to be major.
Mm-hmm. You want every percent.
Yeah, so I often, I've given a presentation on this data a few times, and one of my favorite examples to use is, I just picked a random one, but if you take like a cycling time trial at the Tour de France and you translate the difference that we saw in performance, it drops someone from first place to 20-something place. Wow. And again, it depends on the day, but you're right. At high level sport, that kind of difference makes a really, really big difference.
Unreal.
Now, Christian, you seem like a nice guy. Are you ready to have a bunch of professional athletes hate you for your bad news?
Yeah, I don't know. I just I'll stay behind the research paper. I hope they don't look at the author list. Maybe.
Because also like in a bunch of like team sports and like cannabis use must be relatively common, and so this kind of factor, because there are athletes who are like, I'm super diligent and I have every vitamin and I have a very strict regimen to keep my body in peak condition, and then there are the athletes who are like, all right, I'm having a good time, I'm doing this, and so I think the trend toward like this like very highly regimented maintenance of your body to keep your competitive edge, because if you are like certainly in like the major North American sports of like baseball, football, hockey, you're competing for spaces. You have to like maintain your capacity at a high level. I could see something like this really have a dampening effect on cannabis use amongst professional athletes.
I do think that it is, or one thing that we should say, and that's worth thinking about, is you make a great point about, but basically how everything they do matters and goes into the performance. It's not just one thing. So one thing I will say is that we tested essentially the effects of cannabis use on performance acutely, right when you're about to exercise, what do you do? But it doesn't say anything about, is it detrimental to recovery? Is it beneficial for recovery? Does this effect translate when you do different kind of performance tests? So for example, we did 20 minutes of cycling. That's really different than 4 hours of running. Right. So these are just questions that I think people should keep in mind, is that, I don't want to put out there and say that like with the effect we saw should be blanket applied. But.
So Christian, in your experiment, did you control for, that is, hold constant prior experience with cannabis, like only people who'd never tried it or claim to have never tried it, or did you have like a plethora of cannabis exposure?
A little bit, we controlled it. Just from a safety consideration, and this is the standard for human research in cannabis or in Canada on cannabis, is that you're meant to recruit people who are familiar with it. So that, at least in my experience, that is kind of the baseline of where people operate from. So our studies have generally taken people who are all familiar with the cannabis. And on that, basically, we also don't try to take people who, based on our study schedule, would be smoking more than they usually would be, or using cannabis more than they usually would be, whether it's smoking or not.
I guess one of the things I want to know as someone who researches this cannabis is, what are some of the common misconceptions about cannabis that people might have?
That's a really good question. I would say I want to be careful here, because I think there's two camps of people. I think there's some people who probably think, cannabis is much better than cigarettes. Cannabis is really not associated with long-term health consequences. And then there's the exact opposite. There's people who think cannabis will rot your brain.
Absolutely.
I think I would say that, it's kind of the classic, the truth falls somewhere in the middle. I will say that for a lot of the conditions that we see associated with long-term cigarette use, the evidence for cannabis being just as bad is not as strong. So when you I'll just pick one example, but if you look at something like lung cancer, that's one thing that we know cigarettes are really, really good at giving people, essentially.
Right.
That evidence, or the association between lifetime cannabis use and lung cancer, is not as strong and is kind of inconsistently reported too in studies. I would also say, to the other side, I suppose, that, cannabis is often marketed as a great natural medicinal product. And I think, there's certain conditions where it is shown to be helpful. And in some cases, it's more accepted that it's beneficial. But I think certainly like marketing for your average cannabis product by a cannabis company is probably quite exaggerated as well.
Right.
With respect to the cardiovascular stuff, which is truly what I care about, I think there's emerging evidence that cannabis might have some detrimental effects long term. If you had to make me feel to guess, I would say that it's probably not going to be as bad as cigarettes. However, I don't think that it's safe to assume that we're not doing anything detrimental to our health when we're using cannabis. I hope that was a balanced answer. That's kind of a scary one to answer.
No. Yeah. I really like that answer.
Yeah. So you look at the cardiovascular system, but of course our body is, comprised of 11 or so, however we want to break it down, organ systems. Do you know of the effects of cannabis on other organ systems that might be interacting, good or bad?
Yeah, so I think from a cardiovascular perspective, the respiratory system is probably the easiest one to look at.
Right.
And I would say that, again, it kind of actually goes back to the similar answer. When we look at lung function long term, we see reductions in really, really heavy users. But people who use more moderately don't see that substantial of a reduction in lung function. That's one there. This one's a little bit tricky, and this is actually kind of a cool fact that a lot of people don't know. But one of the reasons why it's a little bit of a black box with cannabis is that the primary receptors that THC and CBD, to some extent, act on are actually quite ubiquitously expressed in all our tissues. So, I don't know for every organ system what happens. Obviously, it has effects on the brain, which would affect the cardiovascular system, right? Like, it's not a stretch, and many people could probably appreciate that, if it increases feelings of anxiety, that could have an effect on how our cardiovascular system is regulated, for example. And I don't know for all different tissues. If I just keep thinking down the list, I don't really know what it does to your GI system. I'm sure there's something there.
Urinary system. What does it do?
Yeah.
Integumentary.
Top 5.
If we ever get there, I will say I think the first thing that we need to figure out is how much cannabis or cannabinoids actually get to those tissues when we ingest it, because that's probably the first step that might get overlooked.
It sounds like cannabis, like we're at the real beginning, like the early days of cannabis research and its effect on the human body.
Yeah, what's interesting, and I've kind of developed an appreciation for this over time, but it's not like studies haven't been done over time. Like a lot of the studies that I have cited and research papers I've done, or like really seminal studies I've used, have been done in the 70s or even the 60s. So it's not like it's completely unknown. I think it just speaks to how much research actually needs to be done as a whole to really understand what, a drug or a behavior does to our bodies. So hopefully we'll be there soon, but we could certainly use more groups doing cannabis research, and hopefully a few countries where maybe it's a little bit easier to do the research too.
So how did you get into studying cannabis, Christian?
It's a great question. It really is. So I guess it's a combination of two things. One, I will say, is I graduated my degree in essentially kinesiology in 2018. At the time, I was really fortunate to have secured a research, kind of like a undergraduate research position in the lab I currently work in, which, like I said, prior to the past few years, had nothing to do with cannabis. It's all about cardiovascular and exercise physiology. But in, I guess, talking about interest in doing a master's with my now supervisor, we talked about a lot of things. And one of the things that just came up casually in conversation was just this notion that, hey, this is becoming legalized for recreational use in a few months, maybe. Let's, see what's out there and understand if maybe there's some opportunities. So I guess some dumb luck with timing, maybe. And then also I will acknowledge a supervisor who was crazy enough to take it on as well, because it's certainly been a roller coaster.
Yeah, I bet.
That's a fascinating topic.
And were you always, what was little Christian like? Were you always into science and sports and that sort of thing?
That's a good question. I guess it depends on how little you go back. I think as like
fetus.
Yeah, I've been playing basketball since -4.
That's impressive.
I think probably when I was a really young kid, I was actually much less interested in sports than I am now. Kind of took me maybe until I was 10 or something. And then I referred to basketball because that was the first sport that I ever enjoyed. I'll always shout out, I'm a huge Toronto Raptors fan. So that, they kind of brought me in. Yeah. And then from there, I kind of just started playing sports and getting more involved with sports, watching more, really enjoying it. And then I chose to do kinesiology for my undergrad and then got into it from there. And it just turned out that there was a great exercise and performance lab at the University of Guelph, which I had no idea at the time. And then, found it through that. So I happened very organically and by happenstance, I'd say.
Very cool.
Just in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, it really feels that way.
And so you mentioned in your hobbies, you do a lot of sporty things. Do you find now that you really know scientifically how the body works, does that sort of affect it? Are you ugh, I really want a donut, but I know if I eat a donut, it's going to spike my blood sugar and I won't be at peak performance, so I won't. Do you find your deep knowledge of how the body works affects your behaviors?
Yeah, has your learning affected how you exercise?
1,000,000%. It helps that the people I work with are also my friends, and we're all kind of exercise and nutrition nerds, so we're always constantly when we're watching sports, kind of watching it through the lens of what we know. When we're playing sports, we're also applying what we learn in the lab, and what we try to do best practice when it comes to our stuff to give ourselves the edge, because we're all maybe predictable from people being in a sports and exercise lab, but we're all a little bit of competitive people. So we're definitely applying it. The only thing I will say is that, as I know you mentioned cycling in my bio, which is, a prolonged sport, I actually will be eating that donut because I want that sugar. So
Wait, for all the listeners. So to eat donuts, we should be biking? Is that it? That's the correlation?
I will say this. I didn't expect this interview to go here, but one of my favorite things about doing endurance sports is that your body actually oxidizes much more glucose and carbohydrates during endurance exercise than you think. So if you're doing lots of prolonged exercise, you're probably eating less sugar than you expect you should be. And you'd probably be surprised about how much is recommended for optimal performance.
Whoa. Okay. So how much, how far do I have to run, Christian, to legitimize 3 donuts?
Yeah,
let's say.
You're not an exercise-based question. This is a donut-based
yes,
question.
The donuts are the priority. If I were to eat 3 donuts, is that 5K, 10K?
Well, you know what? I don't know that I can do the back of the napkin math right here, but I can give you a rough estimate. So we can actually do this. So one of the things that I want to make sure I get this right, but Katie, I don't want to make any assumptions, but would it be safe to say you are not an elite level athlete?
That was so kind of you. It is very safe and recommended to say I'm not an elite athlete.
Okay. So the reason I ask is that elite athletes who can do higher work rates will need more. So we can just, I was just placing us on the end.
Yeah,
so
scratch that.
Start
at the bottom.
The only elite activity that we do is eating donuts.
So let's put it this way. So I think the best practice recommendation, I really hope I'm getting this right. I want all the listeners to know that this could be wrong and you should look this up yourself and check me. But I believe for an average person, it's probably safe to say that 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates an hour during like a really prolonged exercise bout. So let's say an hour to 2 is probably just sufficient to do what you're doing. So if you say a donut has, let's say, 45 grams of carbohydrates per.
Sure.
It's a big donut, so
you could do maybe 2 hours of exercise and do 3 donuts. But it also depends on your body size and how hard you're working. So this is just kind of a ballpark, but we've got you a few donuts in there.
Oh, perfect. All right, now we have a donut to exercise.
That's why we asked Christian here. We've all been building up to the donut running equation.
I don't know if this is a we statement.
Well, what's next for Christians? Do you want to stay with cannabis? Are you more focused on the cardiovascular system? Do you think you might stray from this topic? Like, where do you see yourself going after this?
It's a good question. And what I tell people who ask me that is I probably am just going to try to keep doing research that I think is fun. I think for my PhD, at least, it'll probably be pretty focused on cannabis because we have some follow-up questions from the study that we just did. But that being said, like one of the things that's great about the lab I'm working in is that I've had a lot of collaborative opportunities to do completely non-cannabis related stuff that's also in exercise. So, I think there's limits about how far I would stray within cardiovascular and exercise physiology, but I'm really enjoying this right now. So hope to do maybe a little bit more work in cannabis at the very least. And then long term, maybe more, maybe not, but definitely stuff within the world of exercise.
Very cool.
That was very awesome. Thank you so much, Christian. We can't wait to see the final results of this study. It sounds really cool.
Yeah, no, I hope that it can get out there sooner rather than later. I'm working on it. As you know, these things take time.
We'll check in 10 years.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, I hope not.
Well, thanks again,
Thank you, Christian, for those great answers. It's a super fascinating subject.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah, very cool.
This is like a whole world of research there. I feel like there's a lot of questions, a lot of people who want to know the answers to these questions. And just in general, like, what are the impacts on our health and our performance? Even if you're not an elite athlete or an elite donut eater, what happens to you?
And it really feels like it's just a whole new area now that it's been legalized here. It's so much easier to study, and hopefully maybe if we dispel some expectations of the effects, maybe it would make it even have effects on the legality elsewhere.
And now we can have a chance of transparency of like, instead of like having all of this thing that people were doing in secret, and now it's out in the open, and it's like, all right, let's be honest and clear about the questions and the effects of what's happening.
Yeah. I wonder how much making it legal has affected how prevalent it is. If it had any effect at all.
A must have. That's a whole other question, though. We'll find another researcher.
We'll have another cannabis researcher for a future episode. That's very cool.
Very cool.
Well, Vinny,
yes, Katie?
We learned a lot today.
I learned real good.
We learned about water having 20 phases.
Yeah,
I thought there were 3. No, I got to read up on my phases.
Yeah. And we also learned about the thing that you said.
I'm glad it was memorable. Different sweeteners.
Different sweeteners. Oh, yes. Stevia. Right.
Stevia's the bad one. You keep bringing up stevia.
Well, that's the only one I really remember.
We don't even eat it.
I just think of it, I always think of it as a person's name. So like all the other ones like sucralose and aspartame, they sound like chemicals.
Sure.
But stevia, I was like, oh, I want to hang out with someone named Stevia.
Well,
that's why I remember it.
Okay.
All right. And we learned so much about the effect of cannabis on performance.
Thanks
That's really
to Christian.
Cool. Thanks, Christian.
All right. Well, if people want to find us, where do they find us on social media, Vin?
Well, you can check us out at LRG Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. We're all there, LRG Pod. And if you're interested in being a guest, or you know someone who might want to be a guest, you can send us an email or have them send us an email at learnrealgoodpodcast@gmail.com. That's learnrealgoodpodcast@gmail.com. Fire us an email if you're like interested in talking to us here on the podcast.
And if you're a learner, if you're a fan of the show, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. And if you could write a written review, we would love that.
Yeah, all of that stuff helps us with the algorithm, helping us get the word out there. And if you know anybody who's into this kind of science communication, wants to learn, share the podcast with them. We'd love to have more listeners come along for the ride.
All right, that's it for this week. Thank you, Vinny.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Christian.
That's it.
See ya.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.